And joining me now is Executive Chairman of Yellow Brick Road Home Loans, Mark Bouris. Mark, good to chat with you again. So the Housing Australia Future Fund, it got blocked in the upper house last night. Possible another vote this morning, but it doesn't look good. The housing crisis, one of the biggest issues, if not the biggest issue facing Australians right now. Something needs to be done, but fighting over what to do continues.
And of course the Greens have teamed up with the Coalition, which is a pretty unusual outcome, and Senator Pocock as well is also against passing it in the Senate, and they're all jockeying for different positions and asking for various outcomes, and at this stage the Labor Party is not giving in, so it may be a failed attempt to get this through, which is really designed, as you said, to help Australians get into affordable housing.
Mortgage holders are finding it much harder than they have ever had before. We look at the 80s and 90s and variable rates were 17% there. Of course, housing prices were cheaper and the average was about $26,000, the home loan. But despite variable rates, 8% nowadays, home loan figures have skyrocketed. We're seeing 58% of incomes go straight to home repayments, and now news 1.5 million migrants coming to Australia in the next 5 years. This is not looking good for mortgage holders, and then that feeds to renters as well.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting environment. Everybody keeps saying, you know, people used to be tougher, say in the 90s and late 80s, when we had inflation was like 11% and interest rates were 17%, as you just said. But what we've got to remember is Australians today have borrowed around 6 times more relative to their income than they did back in the 90s. So as a result of that, we don't need a 17% interest rate in order to have the same effect as it had back in the 90s. In fact, the current interest rate at around variable rate around 7.5% to 8%. In fact, that rate is takes far bigger a chunk out of everybody's net pay than it did in the 90s. And right now it's taking around close to 58% of borrowers' net income after tax. So it's a big deal, and that sort of flows us straight into the whole question of, are these interest rates actually effective enough to control inflation? And it definitely is stopping borrowers, people who have borrowed money, people who have mortgages. It is definitely stopping them from spending money. In fact, probably it stopped them spending money 4 or 5 rate rises ago. The question is, what about the other people?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's economists that have been coming out after the budget saying that they believe that more rate rises are on the way, and there's economists in the opposition, they're not believing the Treasury forecast in the budget that inflation is going to be coming down fast next year to 3.25%, saying there's enough stimulus and spending in this budget to keep inflation going, and therefore interest rates are going up. What do you think?
Well, there is two-thirds of the people in this country do not have a mortgage. So there's only 1/3 have a mortgage. And we have people who've never borrowed any money or people who've paid their mortgage off. And those people are enjoying a 3.5% unemployment number. So those people have all got jobs, and the rest of them are retired people who've got their money on deposit, and they're earning a higher interest rate than they've ever earned in the past 10 years. So those particular individuals are fueling inflation in this country. And then when you overlay that with the budget, which wasn't as restrained as I would have expected, the money that's been tipped into the economy by that budget is going to do nothing but keep inflation rolling. So it's not going to be over-inflationary, but when you add to the fact there is two-thirds of the country who have no interest rate constraints, in other words, they're not paying any interest on anything. In fact, they're earning interest. That is not going to stop inflation. So inflation is going to continue to rise. Well, it's not going to fall at the rate we're expecting. So it will fall, but prices will still rise, but at a slower rate. But we're not going to be seeing 3.25 within 12 months' time, which means the only thing the Reserve Bank can do is put up the interest rates again to push inflation down to where they want to have it.
Okay. Mark Bouris, thanks so much for your time this morning.
You're welcome.